Okay, so you want to be a samurai. Guaranteed income paid every single year, backed directly by the government, denominated in something every human being on Earth actually needs: rice. No stock market crash can wipe it out. No currency devaluation can erase it overnight. On paper, you are holding the single safest salary in the entire feudal world, immune to the kind of collapse that could ruin a merchant's fortune in an afternoon. Here is the number that ruins that picture completely. By the middle of the Edo period, a significant share of Japan's warrior class, the exact same class that stood at the legal top of the entire social order, was quietly, permanently, and almost structurally in debt to the merchants sitting at the very bottom of it. Some of the most prestigious retainer families in the shogun's own direct service were pawning their swords, selling their armor, and quietly liquidating family heirlooms just to put food on the table. Not because the government stopped paying them, it paid exactly what the ledger promised, every single year, on schedule, for 2.5 centuries. The system worked precisely as designed, and that, I think, is the most unsettling part of this whole story. The design itself is what destroyed them. So let's actually walk through what it meant in practical daily terms to live on a rice stipend in Tokugawa Japan. Not the legend of the noble warrior who stood above vulgar money matters. The real math of a salary you could never sell, never diversify, never renegotiate, and never fully convert into cash without losing a piece of it somewhere along the way. First, we need to understand what this income actually was, because calling it a salary is already a small act of misdirection. Under the koku system, introduced nationwide during Toyotomi Hideyoshi's land surveys of the late 16th century, and carried forward as the backbone of the entire Edo period economy, wealth and rank were measured in koku. One koku was a volume of unhulled rice, roughly 180 liters, theoretically enough to feed a single adult for a full year. And here's the detail I find genuinely striking every time I come back to it. Everything in this society was priced in the same unit. A domain's size, a lord's prestige, a warrior's stipend, the wealth of an entire province, all expressed through the same physical measurement of grain. A daimyo, a feudal lord, needed to command at least 10,000 koku of assessed land just to legally hold that title at all. Below the daimyo sat the hatamoto, the bannermen, direct retainers of the shogun with the personal right to an audience, and below them the gokenin, housemen who lacked that particular privilege but otherwise lived a broadly similar existence. Both groups received their entire livelihood the same way: fixed rice, paid out on a schedule, generation after generation, family after family, for as long as the shogunate itself lasted. Now here is the detail that changes everything about how you should think about this arrangement. Your koku number was never simply a paycheck sitting there for you to spend as you liked. It was the budget for an entire household operation, and the government expected you to spend it accordingly, whether the math actually worked out or not. Bannerman stipends came bundled with an attached military obligation, a required retainer force scaled directly to your income bracket. A hatamoto earning 200 koku was expected to maintain a household staff of 5, 1 lancer, 1 swordsman, and 3 manservants. A hatamoto at the very top of that bracket, 10,000 koku, was required to field 235 people. 20 riflemen, 10 archers, 30 lancers, 16 swordsmen, 10 cavalry troops, 3 banner carriers, and 149 manservants. And this wasn't some early requirement quietly phased out as times changed. That obligation stayed technically in force until 1862, well into the terminal decline of the entire system. So, before you have spent a single coin on rent, food, clothing, or basic upkeep, your stipend already carries a mandatory military payroll attached to it by law. The number sitting on your household's ledger was never meant to be pocketed. It was meant to be redistributed downward through your own establishment almost immediately, and the government's expectations did not shrink just because your actual cash position had gotten tight. Here's where the naive picture really starts to crack, because rice is not money, and turning it into money was never, ever free. A samurai did not walk into a market stall with a sack of grain slung over his shoulder and buy his own dinner. Domain rice was collected in warehouses, kura, frequently located far from where the samurai himself actually lived, and it had to be shipped, stored, and converted into usable currency through a chain of licensed intermediaries. In Osaka, and especially in Edo, this necessity gave rise to an entirely new merchant class, the fudasashi, literally note exchangers, whose entire business existed for one simple reason. Samurai had rice, samurai needed cash. And someone standing in the middle of that exchange got paid every single time the conversion happened, whether the year was prosperous or lean. Here's the first mechanism that quietly bled money out of every stipend, long before a single grain of rice ever reached your household. The shogunate set an official conversion figure, the harigami neidan, the posted price, used to calculate cash equivalents for stipend purposes across the entire retainer corps. That posted price routinely diverged from the actual, real-time market price of rice on any given trading day. If the true market price sat below the official posted figure, that gap became a silent loss the samurai simply absorbed, because he had no legal alternative but to convert through the sanctioned channel. Now stack the fudasashi's own exchange fee directly on top of that gap, charged on every single transaction without exception, and the full shape of the trap starts coming into focus. You were never actually paid in cash. You were paid in a physical commodity, forced through a conversion pipeline you had no control over, taxed twice on the way out the door. Once by a pricing gap you never had any say in setting, and once by a broker's fee you could not opt out of no matter how you tried. Sit with what that meant across an entire career, an entire family lineage, generation after generation, converting the exact same fixed koku number year after year through the exact same structural bottleneck. Because here's the number that really tells you how this game actually played out. Historical estimates place the average fudasashi broker's annual income at roughly 1,000 ryo, a level of wealth comparable to what a Hatamoto earning at least 5,000 koku himself received in direct government stipend. Read that back slowly. The man handling your paperwork, the middleman, whose entire job existed only because your stipend arrived in the wrong form, could be as wealthy as one of the highest-ranking bannermen in the entire retainer corps of the shogunate, purely off the fees generated by moving other people's rice into other people's cash. Let's talk now about where all that laboriously converted cash actually had to go. Because the expenses waiting on the far side of every conversion were never optional. The single largest structural cost imposed on the entire warrior class, daimyo and their retainers alike, was sankin kotai, the alternate attendance system, which required every feudal lord, and by extension a substantial portion of the retainer hierarchy beneath him, to maintain two complete households simultaneously, one back in the home domain and one in the shogun's capital at Edo, and to physically travel between the two on a fixed calendar with an entourage sized precisely to project appropriate rank and status. I want to be clear that this was not some optional lifestyle flourish a lord could quietly scale back in a tight year. It was compulsory state policy, deliberately engineered by the shogunate to keep regional lords financially and logistically tethered so tightly that they could never accumulate the surplus resources needed to organize a serious rebellion. A domain's income might look genuinely impressive written down on paper, but a meaningful share of it, sometimes the clear majority of all discretionary spending in a given year, disappeared straight into maintaining two full residences, staffing both of them year-round whether the lord himself was physically present or not, and funding a procession large enough that showing up with too small an entourage would have been read across the entire political class as a calculated insult rather than simple frugality. I find this part genuinely remarkable every time I think it through properly. This was a government that intentionally engineered a nationwide system of forced conspicuous consumption purely as an instrument of political control, and it worked exactly as designed for well over 2 centuries straight, right up until it quietly, invisibly, bankrupted the very warrior class it had been built to keep permanently loyal and permanently weak. Below the daimyo level, Hatamoto and Gokenin were not formally required to maintain 2 separate households in the same way, but the identical underlying pressure applied at a smaller, more personal scale. Status had to be visibly performed, constantly, in public. A retainer's household size, the quality of his clothing, the condition of his weapons, and his general standard of living were all expected to correspond to his official rank, entirely regardless of whether his fixed koku income could actually support that appearance in practice. And here is the exact mechanism that turned a merely tight household budget into a genuine multi-generational debt spiral. Prices for nearly everything a samurai household needed to purchase, cloth, lamp oil, construction materials, urban rent, steadily climbed across the length of the Edo period as Japan's cash economy expanded and its cities swelled in population and commercial activity. Your stipend, however, did not climb alongside any of it. It sat fixed in koku, and koku's actual cash value depended entirely on that same volatile posted price we just discussed. So picture a household facing steadily rising costs, tied permanently to an income that legally could not grow, converted through a broker who took his cut both coming and going. The arithmetic here only ever moves in one direction over the span of decades, and I think it's worth saying plainly that it is not the direction that favors the man carrying the sword. So what do you actually do when the fixed stipend arriving twice or 3 times a year simply isn't enough to cover what's already due before that payment even lands? You borrow against next year's rice. And this is precisely where the fudasashi transform from simple currency exchangers into something that looks remarkably like a modern payday lender. Except in this case, your collateral is a stipend you are legally guaranteed to keep receiving from the same government for the rest of your natural life. On paper, that should sound like the safest imaginable loan a merchant could ever extend. The borrower's income is guaranteed by the shogunate itself, backed by the full authority of the state. In practice, it created exactly the kind of dependency you would expect from any lender holding leverage over a desperate, status-bound borrower. Samurai routinely sold their upcoming stipend forward, sometimes several years forward at once, receiving cash today against rice they had not yet actually been paid, at a discount rate that only grew steeper the more visibly desperate the borrower became. Interest accumulated on top of interest. Rolled forward loans compounded year after year. And because the fudasashi held a state-guaranteed income stream as their collateral, they had every rational incentive to keep extending fresh credit for as long as the terms remained profitable, which in practice meant they had every incentive to let a struggling household dig itself steadily, quietly deeper into debt, rather than cut the relationship off early and lose a paying customer. It's worth pausing here on something that I think gets lost in most tellings of this period. The fudasashi did not stay quiet, humble background operators once this wealth started flowing. Many of them became prominent, visible patrons of Edo's urban entertainment culture, the kabuki theater, the Yoshiwara pleasure district, the whole flourishing world of townsman leisure that the samurai class was officially supposed to consider beneath its dignity. You had, in effect, merchants legally ranked at the bottom of society, funding and frequenting the most fashionable venues in the capital, while the warriors, legally ranked above them, were quietly negotiating extensions on last season's rice advance. That inversion did not go unnoticed by contemporaries, and it certainly did not go unnoticed by the sons of struggling retainer households growing up watching it happen in real time. Now, you might reasonably expect the shogunate to step in at some point and actually fix this structural problem, and it did, repeatedly, across more than a century. But watch closely what actually happened each time it tried, because I think this is the part of the story that reveals the real underlying flaw more clearly than anything else we've discussed so far. In 1719, and again far more dramatically in 1789, under the Kansei reforms led by the senior counselor Matsudaira Sadanobu, and once more in 1843, the shogunate issued kienrei, formal debt cancellation edicts, wiping out or suspending outright the debts owed by Hatamoto and Gokenin to the fudasashi brokers. On the day each edict was publicly announced, it must have felt like genuine deliverance. Years, sometimes decades, of quietly compounding debt simply erased by a single government decree. Here is the problem hiding underneath that relief. The fudasashi were never a charity. They were rational businessmen actively managing risk, and every single time the shogunate proved willing to unilaterally cancel their outstanding loans by fiat, it taught them a lesson they had no intention of forgetting. After the first cancellation in 1719, merchants absorbed that initial loss once, then quietly and permanently repriced the entire lending business around the new reality. Spreads widened. Collateral requirements tightened considerably. Some merchant houses simply exited stipend lending altogether, rather than keep absorbing that particular political risk. By the time the far larger 1789 edict arrived, forgiving accumulated principal and suspending years of interest payments in one stroke, the underlying damage to the credit relationship was already baked permanently into the system, and the practical effect on ordinary samurai households in the years immediately following was, by numerous contemporary accounts, noticeably worse than before the relief had ever been granted. Merchants who had already been burned twice were simply no longer willing to extend easy, reasonably priced credit to a borrower class whose own government had just demonstrated, on two separate occasions, that it would erase the debt entirely whenever political pressure climbed high enough. By the time the third edict rolled around, in 1843, serious merchant houses were no longer extending meaningful, unsecured credit to samurai borrowers on anything resembling the older, gentler terms at all. Whatever lenders remained willing to participate charged rates that would have seemed almost unthinkable a full century earlier. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think there's a genuinely important and somewhat uncomfortable lesson buried inside it. A policy explicitly designed purely to relieve crushing debt, repeated 3 separate times across more than 100 years, each time made the long-term credit situation for the exact same debtor class measurably worse, not better. The shogunate kept treating the visible symptom, an unbearable debt load, while the actual underlying disease, a fixed commodity income permanently incapable of keeping pace with a rapidly expanding cash economy, remained structurally unfixable without changing the entire stipend system from the ground up, which nobody actually holding power was ever willing to seriously attempt. And the damage in this system wasn't confined purely to the borrowing side of the ledger either. The conversion process itself was quietly vulnerable to manipulation at the very source, long before a single measure of koku ever reached a warehouse door. Domain administrators surveyed farmland, estimated annual yield village by village, and adjusted figures for floods, drought, or a genuinely bad harvest season. That whole process required constant human judgment calls, and judgment calls always leave room for both honest clerical error and quiet administrative convenience. A retainer's stipend renewal could shrink by a koku or two in a given year simply because a magistrate needed to balance a lord's gift budget ahead of the next trip to Edo, and the relevant paperwork simply traveled onward by horseback across the domain, with essentially no realistic way for an individual retainer sitting far down the internal hierarchy to contest a rounding error buried inside somebody else's ledger book. None of this required dramatic, headline-grabbing corruption to matter in the aggregate. A slow accumulation of small administrative adjustments, repeated across decades and across thousands of individual households, compounded quietly in exactly the same direction as everything else running through this story: downward. There's a real historical account that captures this decline better than any statistic can, and I think it's worth telling here. A low-ranking Hatamoto named Katsu Kokichi, who later took the retirement name Musui, left behind a genuinely candid autobiography of his life in the early 19th century, and it reads nothing like the disciplined warrior image most of us carry around in our heads. Katsu was never granted meaningful official preferment, and by his own account, he supplemented his meager stipend by dealing in swords, extracting protection money from local shopkeepers, and generally getting by on muscle, bluff, and improvisation. At one particularly low point, faced with running away from his own household a second time as an adult with a young child, he describes pawning his personal possessions, including a sword that had been a direct gift from his own father, simply to fund his escape. Here was a man born into a hereditary military family, legally positioned above the merchants he was borrowing from and pawning to, and yet functionally dependent on exactly that merchant economy just to survive week to week. His story wasn't universal, and by his own admission, much of it reflects his own particular recklessness rather than the average retainer's daily experience. But the underlying economic tension he lived inside, status without corresponding purchasing power, rank without corresponding liquidity, was not unique to him at all. It was simply the sharpest, most visible edge of a pressure sitting quietly underneath the entire warrior class. Some retainers found smaller, quieter workarounds rather than Katsu's chaotic path. Lower-ranking samurai increasingly took up goyo konin, officially sanctioned side employment, working as scribes, tutors, or minor craftsmen, quietly supplementing an income that could no longer support the lifestyle their inherited rank formally demanded of them. Technically, this sat somewhat beneath the dignity the class was supposed to project, and everyone involved understood exactly what that particular compromise represented in practice. Better paid, slightly undignified work you weren't officially supposed to need than an open admission of hunger you absolutely could not afford to make in public. By the later Edo period, the social contradiction sitting at the very center of this entire system had become genuinely impossible to ignore, even for the people living directly inside it. The formal class law of the time stated plainly, without ambiguity, that farmers produce, warriors rule, and merchants occupy the lowest rung of respectable society. And yet, by any honest measure of actual day-to-day purchasing power, a successful fudasashi broker operating out of Edo could comfortably out-earn the majority of the shogun's own direct retainers, live in visibly greater physical comfort, and hold more genuine financial leverage over the warrior households nominally ranked above him than almost any samurai could ever hope to hold over him in return. The sons of proud hereditary retainer families grew up watching merchant tutors and merchant creditors live noticeably better than their own fathers, men who carried swords and carried official rank, but increasingly could not cover their own household's basic annual expenses without borrowing from precisely the class their entire legal and social framework had been constructed to look down upon. That kind of quiet inversion does not flip the formal social order overnight. Law and public status remained frozen firmly in place for generation after generation, but it corrodes something underneath the surface all the same. And by the time the Tokugawa order finally collapsed in the middle of the 19th century, a substantial share of the once proud warrior class had already been financially hollowed out for decades, propped up by borrowed money, discounted future stipends, and a rotating cycle of government debt relief that only ever bought a few years of breathing room before the exact same underlying pressures reasserted themselves all over again. So let's put the whole picture together, because I think it's genuinely worth stepping all the way back and looking at what this system actually was, stripped completely of its romantic framing. A samurai's income was never cash. It was a fixed quantity of a single physical commodity, rice, that had to be converted through licensed middlemen at a government-set price that routinely diverged from the real market, minus a broker's fee charged on every single transaction along the way. All of it attached to a mandatory household and retainer structure sized strictly to your official rank rather than to your actual disposable income, exposed to a steadily rising cash-based cost of living that your stipend itself was legally incapable of ever rising to meet, propped up in lean years by borrowing against future income you were contractually guaranteed to eventually receive but could never renegotiate the underlying terms of, and periodically rescued by government debt cancellation that, each and every time, quietly made the underlying credit relationship measurably worse for the very next generation standing in line behind you. You thought you were being paid the single safest salary available anywhere in the entire feudal world, backed directly by the government itself, denominated in something every human being on the planet genuinely needs, apparently immune to the kind of sudden collapse that could wipe out a merchant's entire fortune in a single unlucky afternoon. What you actually held, in practice, was an undiversified, non-negotiable commodity position, converted at a price you never had any say in setting, through a broker you were legally forbidden from openly respecting, spent entirely on a household budget you were required by law to maintain regardless of whether the underlying math still worked in your favor. The sword sat formally at the very top of the social order for well over 2.5 centuries. The ledger, quietly and almost invisibly, had already slid it underneath the very merchants it was never supposed to have to answer to at all.